Doctor accused the janitor of theft, but when the truth came out, he fell to his knees begging for forgiveness. Dr. Thomas Radcliffe was a man of routine. Every morning, he walked briskly through the pristine halls of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, a towering figure of authority and respect. His tailored white coat flared slightly with his steps, and nurses nodded with deference as he passed. Thomas believed in precision, both in surgery and in life. However, what he couldn't control unnerved him, and that morning, as he arrived in his office, his world seemed to tilt. His wallet was missing. Carmen Alvarez, a quiet but diligent woman, had been working as the hospital's custodian for nearly 10 years. She took pride in her job, never once causing trouble. But today, trouble found her. Dr. Radcliffe's voice echoed down the hallway, louder than usual. The word thief stung her ears as whispers followed in its wake. Carmen stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her cleaning supplies. "Doctor, I don't understand," she began softly, her voice almost swallowed by the accusation. "Don't pretend," Thomas cut her off, glaring. "My wallet was on the desk this morning, and you were the only one here." The room seemed to shrink as the tension built. A few nurses exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Carmen's face flushed with humiliation, but she remained calm, her eyes locked on the doctor's, pleading for understanding. "I didn't take anything," she whispered. "Save it," Thomas snapped. His words were harsh, but inside, there was a gnawing doubt he couldn't shake. Still, he pushed it aside, driven by his frustration. The hospital hallways, usually filled with the soft hum of activity, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, a mix of curiosity and unease. Carmen stood there, trying to gather her thoughts, but every fiber of her being screamed of the injustice she was facing. She could feel the weight of the nurses' eyes on her, their judgment pressing in, making it harder to breathe. Dr. Radcliffe crossed his arms, standing tall, his gaze cold. He wasn't known for making mistakes, and in his mind, this situation was no exception. "I'll have to report this," he stated, his tone formal and detached, as though this was just another procedure. Carmen's lips quivered, but she remained steadfast. "Doctor, please. I have never stolen anything in my life." Her voice was steady now, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You know me." Thomas looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, something in his chest tightened. He did know her. Carmen had worked in the hospital for years. She had always been reliable, invisible, really, someone who blended into the background, never causing any trouble. But he couldn't afford to doubt himself now, not when his authority was being questioned. "Carmen, if it's true, then where is my wallet?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the small space between them. "I don't know," she said softly, shaking her head. "But I didn't take it. I swear." The silence that followed felt oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of a heart monitor beeping in one of the patient rooms. The air in the hallway was thick with tension, and Carmen could see the doubt flicker in the eyes of those around her. Suddenly, one of the nurses stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Doctor, maybe we should check the cameras. There are security cameras in your office hallway, right?" Thomas blinked, momentarily thrown off. The cameras. How had he forgotten? He cleared his throat. "Yes, of course. We'll check them." He turned on his heel, signaling for Carmen to follow him to the security office. The hallway seemed to breathe again as the onlookers scattered, but the unease hung in the air, trailing after them like a shadow. As they entered the small, dimly lit security room, the atmosphere shifted. The guard on duty glanced up from his monitors, a little startled to see the doctor and the custodian standing side by side. "We need to review the footage from this morning," Thomas said, his voice gruff. The guard nodded, pulling up the camera feeds. Carmen stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, every second stretching into an eternity. She felt the weight of this moment. This was her chance to clear her name. But what if something went wrong? What if there had been a mistake? The fear of what could happen gnawed at her insides. The footage began to play. the security footage flickered on the screen, and the small room was filled with the low hum of the video playing back the events of the morning. Carmen watched anxiously as the camera revealed the quiet hospital corridor, empty and still. Minutes passed, and then, she appeared on screen, pushing her cleaning cart. Her movements were calm, deliberate, nothing out of the ordinary. Dr. Radcliffe stood rigid, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the screen, searching for something, anything, that would confirm his suspicion. But as the footage continued, there was no sign of her entering his office. Carmen never once deviated from her routine. The guard fast-forwarded through the footage, and soon after Carmen left, another figure appeared. It was a nurse, Nancy, one of the newer recruits. She was seen glancing around nervously before slipping into Dr. Radcliffe's office. Carmen's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to look at the doctor. Thomas's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had been wrong. Horribly wrong. "Nancy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The tension drained from his body, and he took a step back, stunned. He had accused Carmen, shamed her in front of everyone, only to discover it was someone else entirely. Carmen watched him, a mixture of relief and sorrow swelling in her chest. She had known the truth all along, but seeing his reaction made it all the more painful. She had trusted Dr. Radcliffe, he had always been stern but fair, or so she thought. Now, she wasn't sure what to feel. I didn't know," Thomas stammered, his eyes finally meeting hers, filled with guilt. "I was certain," his voice trailed off, as if he couldn't find the right words to express the weight of his mistake. Carmen stood silently, not knowing what to say. The damage had already been done, and no apology could take back the humiliation she had endured. The doctor turned back to the security guard. "Where is Nancy now?" His tone was more composed, but there was an unmistakable tremor beneath it. "She clocked out an hour ago," the guard replied, eyes darting between the two of them. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustrated and torn. He knew he had to confront Nancy, but first, he had to make amends with the woman standing before him. He turned to Carmen, his pride crumbling with each passing second. The doctor who had stood tall and unyielding in the hospital halls now felt small, his authority shattered by his own hasty judgment. "Carmen," he began, his voice soft, pleading. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I need you to know that I was wrong." Her expression remained calm, though her eyes betrayed the hurt she still felt. "You didn't believe me," she said quietly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "You didn't even give me a chance." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. She was right. He had jumped to conclusions, blinded by his own frustration and assumptions. He had let his position cloud his judgment. "I'll make this right," he promised, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how, but I will." Carmen didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure if she could trust his words anymore. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a man broken by his own guilt, desperate to make amends. Slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "But it won't be easy." Thomas nodded, understanding the enormity of what he had done. "I'll start by clearing your name," he said firmly. "And then, I'll make sure Nancy is held accountable." As they left the security room, the weight of the morning's events still hung heavily between them. But something had shifted. The truth had come to light, and with it, the first fragile steps toward healing. The hospital was quieter now, the usual hustle and bustle reduced to the soft sounds of machines beeping and the occasional distant murmur of voices. But within Dr. Radcliffe, a storm brewed. His thoughts were a chaotic mess as he made his way back to his office, Carmen walking beside him in silence. She had been cleared, but the damage lingered like a scar that wouldn't heal easily. By the time they reached his office, the weight of his earlier accusation had fully settled on him. He sat down heavily behind his desk, rubbing his temples as if to ward off the headache pounding in his skull. Carmen stood in the doorway, unsure whether to leave or stay. Part of her wanted to simply walk away, to let him deal with the consequences of his actions. But another part of her, the part that had spent years working in this hospital, felt the need to see this through. She had invested too much of herself here to walk away now. Dr. Radcliffe looked up, his face lined with stress. "I'll file a formal report against Nancy," he said, his voice heavy. "She'll face disciplinary action, possibly termination." Carmen nodded, though her emotions were far from settled. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "How do you plan to fix what you did to me?" Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, Carmen. I'll clear your name with the staff, issue a public apology if that's what you want. But I can't undo what happened." His eyes searched hers, hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but all he found was the same quiet strength that had always defined her. "That's not enough," she said, her voice steady but firm. "An apology won't erase the looks I've gotten from the nurses. It won't take back the shame I felt when you called me a thief in front of everyone." Thomas looked away, ashamed. He knew she was right. His words had caused irreparable damage, not just to her reputation but to her sense of dignity. "Tell me what you want me to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carmen took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her cleaning bag. "I want you to be better than this," she said. "I want you to think before you act. To treat people like they matter, not just as parts of this machine you run." Her words cut through him like a scalpel, precise and unyielding. For years, Thomas had prided himself on his efficiency, his ability to run a tight ship at the hospital. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the very people who made it function. "I will," he promised, his voice filled with a sincerity she hadn't heard before. "I'll do better." Before either of them could say more, there was a knock at the door. It was the hospital administrator, Mrs. Peterson, a stern woman known for her no-nonsense approach to handling problems. "Thomas, I need to speak with you about this morning's incident," she said, her gaze shifting momentarily to Carmen, acknowledging her presence with a small nod. "I've been informed about what happened, and we need to discuss the next steps." Thomas stood, his demeanor shifting back into his usual authoritative stance. "Of course," he said. He glanced at Carmen, his eyes softening again. "You're free to go for now, Carmen. I'll take care of the report." Carmen hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping out of the office. As the door closed behind her, she could feel the stares from the few staff members still lingering in the hallway. She kept her head high, but inside, the frustration gnawed at her. The damage might be undone on paper, but the whispers wouldn't disappear so easily. As she walked away, she heard the voices of Thomas and Mrs. Peterson through the door, their conversation tense. "Thomas, this is serious," Mrs. Peterson said. "We can't afford incidents like this, especially not with someone as valuable as Carmen. The staff is already talking, and we need to handle this delicately." "I know," Thomas replied, his voice tight. "I'll issue a public apology." "But what about Nancy?" "We'll deal with her," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone clipped. "But right now, the focus needs to be on repairing the damage you've done to Carmen's reputation. I suggest you start immediately." The door closed completely, and Carmen was left with the weight of what had happened. She had been cleared, yes. But the scars would take time to heal, and she wasn't sure if things would ever truly return to normal. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the hospital remained strained. News of the incident had spread like wildfire, and though Carmen's name had been officially cleared, the undercurrent of gossip persisted. People whispered in the break rooms, exchanged glances in the hallways. For some, the apology issued by Dr. Radcliffe seemed insincere, a formality to cover his mistake. For others, it was a shock to see the untouchable doctor humbled by such an error. Carmen went about her work in silence, her movement steady, but the heaviness of the ordeal clung to her. The hospital had always been her sanctuary, a place where she felt valued, even if only in small, unspoken ways. Now, it felt like a battleground, where every glance held judgment, and every interaction carried hidden meaning. One afternoon, while she was scrubbing down the floors in one of the quieter wings, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Carmen." She looked up to see Marisol, a nurse who had always been kind to her. They had never been particularly close, but there was a warmth in their exchanges that Carmen had come to appreciate. "Hi, Marisol," Carmen said, standing and wiping her hands on her apron. Marisol hesitated, her expression conflicted. "I heard what happened," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about everything." Carmen smiled faintly, though the words didn't reach her heart. "Thank you," she replied, though she wasn't sure what to say beyond that. Marisol took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I know people have been talking, but for what it's worth, I never believed you took anything. You've always been one of the most honest people here." Carmen's throat tightened. It was one thing to hear an apology from Dr. Radcliffe, but hearing this from Marisol, someone who had no obligation to say anything, meant more than she could express. "I appreciate that," Carmen said quietly, feeling a small weight lift from her shoulders. "It's been hard." Marisol nodded, her eyes softening with sympathy. "I can imagine. But don't let them get to you. People will talk no matter what, but the truth always comes out in the end." As Marisol walked away, Carmen stood there for a moment, processing the conversation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, things would get better. But that evening, as she was finishing up her shift, Carmen overheard a conversation that made her heart sink. Two nurses were talking in the break room, their voices hushed but clearly audible through the slightly ajar door. "I don't know why they're making such a big deal about it," one nurse said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I mean, come on, she's just a janitor. It's not like it's the end of the world if someone accused her of something." The other nurse chuckled. "Yeah, and it's not like she can do anything about it. She should just be glad she still has a job." Carmen's blood boiled, but she forced herself to keep walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of knowing she had heard them. Their words stung, a painful reminder of the divide between the hospital staff and people like her, those who worked behind the scenes, invisible unless something went wrong. Later that night, as she sat at home, Carmen couldn't shake the anger that had settled deep in her chest. It wasn't just about the incident anymore. It was about everything, the way people looked at her, the way they talked about her as if she didn't matter. She had always done her job with pride, never asking for recognition. But now, it felt like that pride had been stripped away, leaving only bitterness. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Dr. Radcliffe sat in his apartment, staring at the empty glass in front of him. He had spent the day trying to make amends, offering apologies and explanations, but nothing had eased the knot of guilt in his chest. No matter how many apologies he gave, he knew it wasn't enough. Carmen had been wronged, and it was his fault. And then there was Nancy. The hospital had been quiet about her punishment, but Thomas knew it wouldn't end with a simple reprimand. Nancy had been a trusted member of the staff, and her betrayal felt personal. He still couldn't understand why she had done it. The theft, the lies, it all seemed so out of character. But then again, how much did he really know about the people who worked with him every day? As the clock ticked past midnight, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could at least confront Nancy, get the answers he needed. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the start of fixing what had been broken. The next morning, Dr. Radcliffe arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. The halls were still quiet, and the sun hadn't fully risen, casting a soft glow through the windows. He had barely slept, the events of the past days swirling in his mind. Today, he would confront Nancy. He had to. As he made his way to her office, a sense of dread settled over him. Part of him didn't want to know the full truth, but he had no choice now. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. "Come in," came the faint voice from inside. Thomas opened the door to find Nancy sitting behind her desk, her face pale, eyes tired. She looked up at him, her expression guarded. She knew why he was there. "Nancy," he began, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." She sighed, leaning back in her chair, as if preparing herself for the inevitable. "I figured you'd come sooner or later." Thomas stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. Why? His voice cracked slightly, the weight of his emotions seeping through. Why did you do it? Nancy's eyes flickered with something, guilt, regret, maybe even shame. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said softly. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Didn't mean to hurt anyone? Thomas echoed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You stole from me, and you let Carmen take the fall. Do you have any idea what you've done to her? Nancy flinched at his words, her fingers nervously fidgeting with a pen on her desk. I know, she whispered. I know it was wrong. But I was desperate, Thomas. Desperate? He shook his head, unable to understand. For what? Money? Nancy let out a bitter laugh, her eyes finally meeting his. Do you think I did this for money? No, it wasn't about the money. It was about survival. Thomas blinked, confused. What do you mean? She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. I've been here for almost a year now, working hard, trying to prove myself. But it's never enough, is it? No matter what I do, I'm always overlooked, always in someone else's shadow. You don't even notice people like me. Thomas was stunned into silence. He hadn't expected this. That's not true, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Nancy's eyes flashed with anger now. You walk these halls every day like you're untouchable, like the rest of us don't even exist unless we mess up. And when we do, you come down on us hard, like we're nothing. Thomas stood there, speechless. He hadn't realized how deep the resentment ran. So when I saw the opportunity, Nancy continued, her voice hardening, I took it. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought maybe it would make you see me. But then Carmen got blamed, and I didn't know how to fix it. Thomas swallowed hard, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about theft. It was about something far more personal, a cry for recognition, a desperate plea for validation that had spiraled out of control. Nancy, he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret, I never meant to make you feel invisible. But what you did, it's not something we can just brush aside. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know. I'll resign if that's what it takes. I just want it to matter. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Thomas didn't know what to say. He had come here for answers, and now that he had them, they left him feeling more hollow than before. I'll make sure Carmen knows the truth, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. But this isn't something that can be undone. Nancy wiped at her eyes, nodding silently. I understand. As Thomas turned to leave, a part of him felt relief, but another part felt a deep sadness. He had been blind, not just to Nancy's struggles, but to the way he treated the people around him. The very foundation of his leadership had been shaken, and now, he wasn't sure how to rebuild it. The truth about Nancy's actions spread quickly through the hospital, much like the initial rumors about Carmen's alleged theft. But this time, the atmosphere was different. People spoke in hushed tones, some with disbelief, others with quiet sympathy for both Carmen and Nancy. The betrayal had been unexpected, but the fallout was inevitable. Carmen was in the supply closet when she heard the news. A nurse had passed by, speaking to another about Nancy's resignation, the details of the theft laid bare. Carmen paused, her hands gripping the broom handle tightly. She had known Nancy, though not well. They had exchanged pleasantries in the hallways, shared quiet moments in the break room. And now, everything had changed. As she emerged from the closet, she was greeted by Mrs. Peterson, the hospital administrator, standing by the door with a soft expression. Carmen, may I speak with you for a moment? Mrs. Peterson asked, her tone gentle. Carmen nodded, following her into a small office nearby. She had expected this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier. Mrs. Peterson gestured for her to sit, and Carmen obliged, her heart racing. I want to apologize to you, the administrator began, her voice sincere. The way you were treated was unacceptable, and we've taken steps to ensure that it never happens again. Carmen nodded, but the knot in her stomach remained. She had heard apologies before. What mattered now was how things would change moving forward. We've accepted Nancy's resignation, Mrs. Peterson continued, folding her hands on the desk. But I want you to know that her actions do not define how we view you. You've always been an integral part of this hospital, and we are truly sorry for the way things unfolded. Carmen looked down at her hands, the words washing over her. She appreciated the sentiment, but it still felt hollow. The damage had already been done. The looks, the whispers, they wouldn't disappear overnight. Thank you, she said quietly, though she wasn't sure what else to say. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward, her expression softening. If there's anything you need, anything at all, we're here to support you. Carmen nodded again, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She stood up, ready to leave, when Mrs. Peterson spoke again. And Dr. Radcliffe will be issuing a formal, personal apology to you in front of the staff, she said, her voice firm. We want to make sure that everyone knows the truth, and that your name is fully cleared. Carmen froze for a moment. A public apology from Dr. Radcliffe? The man who had accused her so easily, who had treated her as if she were nothing? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't sure if she wanted to stand in front of the staff and relive that moment. But she knew it was necessary. It was the only way to move forward, to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from her. I'll be there, she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. Later that afternoon, the hospital staff gathered in the main conference room. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, people exchanging glances as they waited for what was to come. Dr. Radcliffe stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His usually composed demeanor was replaced by a visible tension. He had faced tough crowds before, but this felt different. This was personal. Carmen stood off to the side, her hands trembling slightly as she waited. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious. She kept her head high, refusing to show the nerves that churned inside her. Dr. Radcliffe cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice firm but lacking its usual authority. I called this meeting because there's something important that needs to be addressed. He glanced at Carmen, his expression softening. A few days ago, I made a terrible mistake. I accused Carmen Alvarez of theft, without any real evidence. I let my frustration cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I caused harm to someone who has been nothing but loyal and hardworking. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I want to publicly apologize to Carmen for my actions, Thomas continued, his voice shaking slightly. She did not deserve the way I treated her, and I deeply regret the pain I've caused. Carmen, I am truly sorry. Carmen stood there, her emotions swirling. She had waited for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to feel. Relief, perhaps, but also a lingering bitterness that would take time to heal. The staff shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Some murmured their approval, others remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a new understanding, a new awareness of what had transpired. As the meeting ended, Dr. Radcliffe approached Carmen, his eyes filled with remorse. I meant what I said, he murmured, his voice low so only she could hear. If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know. Carmen looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You've done what you can, she said softly. But some things take time. Thomas nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take effort, patience, and a willingness to change. As Carmen left the conference room, she felt a small sense of closure. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed the public apology, Carmen tried to return to her routine. The hospital still felt like a battlefield in some ways, but there were glimmers of change. Some of the nurses who had once avoided her now greeted her with small smiles, offering quiet support. The whispers had quieted, though she could still feel the weight of people's lingering thoughts. But Carmen didn't let it crush her. She was stronger than that. She had survived worse and would survive this, too. One afternoon, as she was cleaning one of the operating rooms, Dr. Radcliffe appeared in the doorway. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the usual confidence in his step somewhat muted. Carmen glanced up but didn't stop working. "Carmen," he said softly, his voice lacking the authority it once held. "Do you have a minute?" She straightened, setting aside her cleaning supplies, and turned to face him. There was an unreadable expression in her eyes, a mix of guardedness and curiosity. "I wanted to check in with you," Thomas continued. "I know the apology was only the first step, and I wanted to see how you were doing." Carmen crossed her arms, looking at him carefully. "I'm fine, doctor," she said, her voice steady but cool. "Just trying to move on." Thomas nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the distance between them. "I understand. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. About the way I handled things, and the way I've treated people." Carmen raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I've always prided myself on being efficient, on running this hospital like a well-oiled machine," he admitted, his voice softening. "But I see now that I've been blind to the people who make it all work. People like you, Carmen. I didn't appreciate what you do, how much you contribute. And that was wrong." Carmen didn't say anything at first, letting his words hang in the air. It was clear that he was struggling to find the right way to make amends, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to accept his words just yet. "Doctor, I've worked here for years," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "I've never asked for much. Just respect. And you took that away from me when you accused me without even giving me a chance to defend myself." Thomas flinched, her words hitting him hard. "I know," he said quietly. "And I can't take back what I did. But I can learn from it. I want to be better, Carmen. Not just for you, but for everyone who works here." Carmen looked at him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. She saw it there, the weight of guilt and a genuine desire to change. For the first time, she saw Thomas not as the towering figure of authority he had always been, but as a man who had made a terrible mistake and was trying to make things right. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "But like I said before, it's going to take time." Thomas nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. "I know. I'll give you that time." With that, he turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, Carmen spoke again. "Doctor." He paused, looking back at her. "I never wanted this," she said, her voice filled with an unexpected vulnerability. "I just wanted to do my job, to be part of something bigger. But this changed everything." Thomas's face softened, and he nodded slowly. "It changed things for me, too," he admitted. "I won't forget that." As he left, Carmen stood there, feeling a strange sense of closure. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but she could see the change in him. It was small, but it was real. In the weeks that followed, Carmen began to notice subtle shifts in the hospital. Dr. Radcliffe was different, more approachable. He spoke to the staff with more care, taking the time to ask how they were doing, not just in passing but genuinely. The nurses, too, seemed to treat Carmen with a newfound respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One day, Marisol caught up with her in the break room, smiling warmly. "Hey, Carmen. How's everything going?" Carmen smiled back, feeling a little lighter than she had in weeks. "Better," she admitted. "I think things are finally starting to change." Marisol nodded. "I can see that. You know, you're stronger than most people here. After everything you went through, you're still standing." Carmen chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I don't know about that." "No, really," Marisol insisted. "You handled this with more grace than anyone else could have. And it's making a difference. Carmen looked down at her cup of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her hands. It was true, things were changing, slowly but surely. She hadn't just survived this ordeal, she had grown from it. And in her own quiet way, she had helped shift the culture of the hospital, showing that even the smallest voice mattered. As she walked through the halls later that day, her footsteps felt lighter. There was still a long way to go, but she knew now that she wasn't invisible. She mattered. And that was enough to keep her going. As time passed, the hospital slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but underneath the surface, the changes were undeniable. Carmen's quiet strength had left a mark on everyone, from the doctors to the janitorial staff. Even Dr. Radcliffe, once aloof and distant, had begun to engage more openly with the people around him. Yet, for all the progress that had been made, Carmen knew that the full resolution of what had happened still lay ahead. One afternoon, as Carmen was finishing up her shift, she received a message that surprised her. Mrs. Peterson had requested a meeting with her in the main office. Her heart skipped a beat. Formal meetings like this weren't typical, especially after everything that had happened. When she arrived, Mrs. Peterson was sitting behind her desk, and to Carmen's surprise, Dr. Radcliffe was already there, waiting with an unreadable expression on his face. "Carmen," Mrs. Peterson began, gesturing for her to sit, "I know this is a bit unexpected, but we wanted to discuss something important with you." Carmen sat down cautiously, her hands resting in her lap. She glanced at Dr. Radcliffe, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "We've been reviewing the situation," Mrs. Peterson continued, "and while we've taken steps to address what happened, we feel that more needs to be done, not just to make amends, but to ensure that something like this never happens again." Carmen felt her chest tighten. She had already been through so much, she wasn't sure she could handle another round of institutional apologies. "That's why," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone shifting to something more formal, "we'd like to offer you a promotion." Carmen blinked, taken aback. "A promotion?" she echoed, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Yes," Mrs. Peterson replied with a smile. "We'd like to promote you to a supervisory role within the facilities management team. You've been here for years, and after everything that's happened, it's clear that you have the strength and leadership qualities we need in this department. This promotion would come with a pay raise, of course, and more responsibility overseeing the janitorial staff." Carmen sat there, her mind racing. A promotion? She had never expected something like this. After all the humiliation, the gossip, and the tension, this felt like a step in the right direction, a chance to rebuild her reputation and take control of her career. But there was also hesitation in her heart. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into a leadership role, especially after everything she had gone through. And yet, a part of her knew that this could be her opportunity to create real change within the hospital, to ensure that no one else ever faced what she had. "Thank you," Carmen said, her voice steady but cautious. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll need some time to think about it." "Of course," Mrs. Peterson said kindly. "Take all the time you need. We're confident that you'll make the right decision." As Carmen stood to leave, Dr. Radcliffe finally spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. "Carmen, I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how much I admire your resilience. This hospital needs more people like you, people who care, who make a difference. I believe you could do great things in this new role." Carmen met his gaze, seeing the genuine respect in his eyes. It wasn't the same man who had accused her, the man who had looked down on her as just a janitor. This was a man who had learned from his mistakes, who had grown alongside her. "I'll consider it," Carmen said, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you." That evening, as she walked home, Carmen couldn't stop thinking about the offer. It was everything she had never expected, a chance to rise above her circumstances, to prove that she was more than just the person they had wronged. But it also came with the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that this was more than just a promotion. It was a chance to change things from the inside. When she reached her small apartment, Carmen sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who did her job without complaint, who didn't ask for recognition. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to step into something bigger. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Marisol. "Hey, heard about the promotion offer. So proud of you. You deserve it. Let me know if you want to talk about it. I'm here for you." Carmen smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't alone in this. People had seen her, recognized her strength, and they were rooting for her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging. As the night deepened, Carmen made her decision. Tomorrow, she would go back to the hospital, not just as the woman who had survived a terrible injustice, but as someone who would use her voice, her experience, to make things better. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible. The next morning, Carmen walked into St. Vincent's Hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. Her decision to accept the promotion had solidified overnight, and now, as she entered the building that had once felt like a battleground, she felt something different: power. Not the kind of power that Dr. Radcliffe had wielded over her, but a quieter strength, a control over her own future. She walked past the nurses who had once whispered about her, their expressions now filled with respect. Word had spread quickly that Carmen was being promoted, and though the gossip hadn't completely disappeared, it had shifted. Now people were talking about her resilience, about how she had turned the situation around. It was no longer just about the theft or the accusation, it was about her rise. As she made her way to Mrs. Peterson's office to officially accept the position, she ran into Dr. Radcliffe in the hallway. He looked different, more relaxed than she had ever seen him. When he noticed her, he smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Carmen," he greeted her. "I've heard you've made your decision." She nodded. "Yes, I'm going to take the position. I think I can do a lot of good here." Thomas's smile widened. "I know you will. I have no doubt that you'll make a huge difference." Carmen hesitated for a moment, then spoke the words that had been sitting in her chest for days. "Thank you, Dr. Radcliffe. For everything, even the hard parts. I think it made me stronger." Thomas's eyes softened. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, Carmen. You've taught me more than you know." They stood there for a moment in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The relationship that had once been marred by distrust and accusations had evolved into something else, something rooted in mutual respect. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something close. As they parted ways, Carmen felt lighter. She entered Mrs. Peterson's office, where the paperwork for her new position awaited. After a brief discussion and signing the necessary documents, it was official: Carmen Alvarez, head of facilities management at St. Vincent's Hospital. The transition was swift. By the following week, Carmen was no longer cleaning the hospital floors, she was overseeing the team that did. It was an adjustment, but one she handled with the same quiet strength she had always shown. Her team respected her, not just because of her new title, but because they knew she understood their work. She had been one of them for years. Under her leadership, things began to change. Carmen implemented new protocols to ensure that all staff members, from the doctors to the janitors, were treated with respect. She made it a point to check in on her team personally, listening to their concerns, making sure they felt valued. It was something the hospital had been missing for a long time, and people began to notice the difference. One afternoon, as Carmen was going through some reports, she received a knock on her office door. It was Nancy. Carmen froze for a moment, surprised to see the woman who had once betrayed her standing in front of her. Nancy looked different, there was no trace of the defensive posture she had once carried. Instead, she looked defeated. "Carmen," Nancy began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I don't know if you want to hear this, but I needed to come and apologize." Carmen set her papers down, watching her carefully. She had imagined this moment many times, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to feel. "I was wrong," Nancy continued, her eyes downcast. "I was angry and bitter, and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have done that. I wanted to be seen, and I didn't think about the damage I was causing." Carmen remained silent, letting Nancy speak. I don't expect you to forgive me, Nancy said, her voice breaking slightly. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I regret everything. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing. Carmen could feel the weight of Nancy's words, the sincerity in her voice. It wasn't an easy apology, and Carmen knew that it took courage for Nancy to come to her like this. I appreciate you coming to me, Carmen said finally, her voice steady but soft. What you did hurt me. A lot. But I've moved on from it. I have a new role now, and I'm focused on making things better, for everyone. Nancy nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm glad. You deserve it. There was a long pause before Carmen spoke again. I can't say I forgive you yet, she admitted, but I'm willing to let the past be the past. We all make mistakes. Nancy smiled weakly, nodding in understanding. That's more than I deserve. As Nancy turned to leave, Carmen called after her. I hope you find what you're looking for, Nancy. Nancy stopped in her tracks, her shoulders shaking slightly. Without turning around, she whispered, I hope so too, and then she was gone. Weeks passed, and the hospital continued to improve under Carmen's leadership. Dr. Radcliffe had become a more approachable figure, often consulting with Carmen on matters of staff morale and hospital operations. There were still challenges, of course, but Carmen faced them head-on, knowing that she was making a difference. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Carmen stood outside the hospital, watching the sun set over the city. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She had gone through the fire, but she had come out stronger. Her phone buzzed. It was Marisol. Dinner tonight, the message read. Carmen smiled, feeling the warmth of friendship fill her chest. She replied with a quick yes, then tucked her phone away, taking one last look at the hospital before heading off to meet her friend. She had finally found her place. As Carmen settled into her new role and the hospital seemed to find its rhythm again, a lingering sense of unease began to grow. She had hoped that the promotion would mark a turning point, a new chapter where things would settle and improve. But whispers began to circulate, new ones that weren't about her, but about Dr. Radcliffe and Nancy. One afternoon, as Carmen was reviewing new procedures with Mrs. Peterson, the administrator's phone rang. She answered, her expression quickly shifting from calm professionalism to concern. Carmen watched as Mrs. Peterson's brows furrowed, her eyes darting toward her. We'll handle it, Mrs. Peterson said firmly into the phone before hanging up. She turned to Carmen, her face tight with worry. Carmen, we need to talk, Mrs. Peterson said, her voice lower than before. There's been a development. Carmen's stomach twisted. She thought she had left the worst behind. What's going on? Mrs. Peterson leaned in, speaking carefully. Nancy didn't resign voluntarily. There was more to the story that we didn't know. She had something on Dr. Radcliffe. And she was using it to manipulate him for months. Carmen's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Mrs. Peterson took a deep breath. Nancy had information, something personal, something that could ruin his career. She threatened to expose him if he didn't cover for her or give her the promotion she wanted. That's why Dr. Radcliffe hesitated for so long before confronting her. Carmen felt the room close in around her. The man who had accused her, the one who had apologized and tried to make things right, had he been hiding something all along? And worse, had Nancy's actions been a result of something even darker beneath the surface? Are you saying he's been blackmailed? Carmen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Peterson nodded. It seems so. But what's even more troubling is that we're starting to uncover some financial discrepancies tied to Radcliffe's department. Nancy wasn't acting alone. Carmen's mind raced. Could it be that the man who had tried to make amends, who had seemed so genuinely remorseful, had been involved in something far worse than a simple mistake? Before Carmen could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Radcliffe himself walked in. His face was pale, his usual confident stride reduced to a slow, almost defeated shuffle. We need to talk, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Carmen looked at him, the man she had just started to trust again. "What's going on, Dr. Radcliffe? Is this true?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, his hands trembling slightly. "It's complicated," he began, his voice filled with regret. "Nancy wasn't the only one who made mistakes. I've made some bad decisions. But I never wanted it to go this far." Carmen's heart pounded in her chest. She had just started to rebuild her life, her career. Could this be another betrayal? "I didn't take any money," Dr. Radcliffe continued, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. "But I let things slide. I turned a blind eye to things I shouldn't have, and now it's all catching up to me." Carmen sat there, numb. Everything she thought she knew about the situation, about the people around her, was unraveling. What had started as a simple accusation of theft had revealed layers of corruption, deceit, and manipulation. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Radcliffe looked down, his guilt plain on his face. "Because I thought I could fix it. I thought I could make things right without dragging anyone else into it. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. Carmen could feel the familiar sense of betrayal rising inside her, the same feeling she had when he had first accused her. Only this time, it was worse. This time, she had believed he had changed, that he had learned from his mistakes. "What happens now?" Carmen asked, her voice hollow. Mrs. Peterson looked between them, her expression grim. "There will be an internal investigation. This is bigger than any of us realized." "I'm sorry, Carmen, but this isn't over." With the internal investigation underway, Carmen once again found herself at the center of a storm. The hospital was on high alert, and tensions among the staff were palpable. Dr. Radcliffe was temporarily suspended from his duties while the board examined the finances and the extent of Nancy's blackmail. In the following weeks, Carmen tried to focus on her new role, but the atmosphere became increasingly difficult. Many colleagues avoided discussing the case, but the stares and whispers had returned. For Carmen, the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming, but now, with her new position, she couldn't afford to back down. The investigation eventually revealed that Nancy had threatened to expose Dr. Radcliffe's personal secrets in order to coerce her promotion. She had also embezzled small amounts with his passive knowledge. The most shocking revelation was that Radcliffe had allowed it to happen out of fear of personal scandal. While he wasn't directly involved in the embezzlement, his moral failure to address the situation had left him compromised. Nancy was fired, and Dr. Radcliffe chose to resign before the board could take more severe action. He met with Carmen one last time, their conversation marked by tension and regret. "I ruined everything, Carmen," he said, his voice breaking. "But I hope, in the end, you find your way. You deserve more than this." Carmen watched him leave, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. The man who had once accused her, who had tried to make amends, was now falling because of his own actions. Yet, she didn't feel satisfaction in his departure, only the understanding that life, and people, were more complicated than they seemed. With Radcliffe and Nancy gone, the hospital slowly began to recover. Carmen, now more confident and respected than ever, made the decision to stay in her new position. The leadership opportunity had not only changed her career but had given her the chance to shape the hospital into a more just environment for everyone. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt in control of her future. The hospital, once a place of pain and injustice for her, was now where she could make a real difference. As she walked through the corridors at the end of another long day, Carmen smiled slightly as she watched the staff moving around her. She was no longer invisible. And to her, that was the greatest victory of all.